Hey everybody, welcome to a special 3-part mini-series of Surface Level, curious conversations about the Black and queer experience. I'm one of your hosts, Jordan, and today I'm joined by Jay Jones, first trans president of the Howard University Student Association, Herbie Ravolis, culture critic and creator, and Kevin Ortega Rojas, host of Here's Why News and co-host of Bi Latin Men podcast. Today, we'll explore how politics are impacting young Americans' daily lives.
How do we do a better job at turning out more people to vote in these local elections so that way we can see people who represent us, people who do things like us, people who want policies like us, to be putting these things into action.
It's personal to me because the first people to create space for me and to hold space for me were Black and Latina trans women in New York.
This specific war was the first time that I felt so connected to the crisis that was happening on the ground in Gaza.
I think that I'm in favor of a third-party, people-powered solution that allows us to identify what information is accurate, what information is inaccurate.
This is The Personal is Political, Part 2. All right, so in part 2 of our mini-series, we're focusing on the youth vote and political engagement. But before we go deeper, let's start on the surface level with an icebreaker that I'm calling Vote or Veto. All right? So I don't want you to think too much about these. I want you to be in the moment, give your knee-jerk reaction. I'll present a scenario about political content on social media, and you'll decide or you'll tell me if you would vote in favor for it or if you would veto it. All right, and let's go in the order of Kevin, Herbie, and Jay.
Yeah.
All right. Creators using memes to spread political information. Vote or veto?
Vote.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm voting for that.
I'll vote. Yeah.
Okay. Any context? Anybody want to share?
Yeah, I'm voting for it because I feel like it is a simple and effective way to get a message across.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Memes have become like a way that people communicate online, like, and with very little context or like conversation. It's just like a universal thing. It just makes ideas so simple to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I synopsisize it with memes being kind of how political cartoons used to be really big.
Yeah.
That's how it is a way to communicate in a short, easy, funny way that still gets everyone's point across about the candidate and their messaging.
Yes. Okay. So unanimous. All right. The next scenario. Social media platforms labeling political posts with fact-checked warnings. Vote or veto?
Vote.
Okay.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's necessary.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm approaching it with equal amounts of caution, but vote. Yeah.
Ooh, where's the caution?
Because, I mean, social media sites are businesses, so I'm not fully aware of who is deciding what is accurate and what is inaccurate information. And so if I was more aware of who is responsible for that, because sometimes I feel like, well, we'll get into that later. But for right now, I'm just going to say that I'm just unsure if they're always accurate in identifying what information is correct or incorrect.
Interesting. Okay, Jay.
I wish there was an abstain option, but I will also say vote with caution. I think that's helpful, but similar, I think that there is a question of who's doing the fact checking that I'm just wondering on a constant basis.
Okay. So based on these answers, I feel like I kind of know how you all might respond to this one. Vote or veto? Social media companies removing posts flagged as misinformation.
Veto.
Okay.
Veto.
Yeah, I'm going to veto that too.
Okay.
Veto.
Okay, I felt that. Anybody want to give like a broad reason why?
I think even if a post is misinformation, people who intentionally share misinformation shouldn't be able to get out of it by having the post removed on their behalf. So if you're following someone who's constantly sharing misinformation, I think it's best for that to stay there, to be like, this is not like a credible source of news.
Okay. All right. My final scenario: politicians paying creators to endorse them on social media. Vote or veto? I knew this. I knew it. I felt it
because
when I
wrote this. I need a check.
Clock it.
So like, if you're watching this, you know, I'm yours. I vote. I don't see what the difference is. At this point, everyone's profile is like a billboard. So Money talks.
Okay. Vote, Herbie.
I'm going to veto that one.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'm
okay.
gonna. Yeah, dare to be different. I'm gonna veto that because I just feel like there's already so many. We're in such a politically polarizing time, and I feel like people think that the Supreme Court is politicized. People think that there's so much mistrust in like elected officials. I would prefer, I know that, we all want a bag and the check is so important. I just feel like it just feeds the issue of distrust amongst the electorate and like the folks who are going to be, I don't know, participating in the voting process. So I'm vetoing it. Don't attack me.
All right.
No, I'm just kidding.
I'm gonna disagree. I think I'll vote. And the only reason I think I still would maintain or prefer because I just had this conversation with my mom the other day where we were having a conversation about all money ain't good money. And similar to how the conversation comes about of you can present the money to people and if the person or the content creator does agree that political person doesn't align or that political person is not in their views, I think that there to still some extent is a freedom to say no. And then I think that at the same time, right, you can still align yourself and still be paid, right? I don't think that you should not be paid for not aligning yourself with certain people. But I think that you should have the option still to still be able to make money. I think that's what I'll say for you and your platform, emphasizing certain people.
Okay. Interesting. Well, thank you for giving me your hot takes on those things. Maybe those will be an actual vote sometime in the future. But I want to get into not changing veto to vote, but maybe at some point we will be deciding on these things. So let's get into our conversation. So I want to start with social media. Obviously, we're already talking about that, but it's completely changed how politicians are able to engage with younger audiences and younger voters. But now we're seeing that social media platforms are limiting the visibility of some political content or posts. How might this be a problem?
Okay. So to the first half of the question or like the statement, I definitely do feel like obviously social media has changed the political landscape, right? To Kevin's point earlier, the memification of like political officials, definitely, it even changes what we deem a political message, right? Because if you think about like the queen of all coconuts, Kamala Harris, and that coconut moment, I think that the context of that message is lost, and that's not even the political message. The political message has become the vibe, her energy, and people are voting based off of how they feel about her, right? And that's now become the biggest draw, right? And that's so I think that's really, we've always voted in the interest of who we think we like, but I think it's just offered us a new way and a more like widespread way to do that. But how might it be an issue? I think I read, I certainly read that half of Americans get at least some of their news from social media, right? So censorship of that information, I think it makes it difficult to engage with activism work. It makes it difficult to spread awareness. But I also would like to assert that I feel like censorship invites the opportunity to engage with activism beyond slacktivism, right? Which is just like the compulsion to like, share, repost, and feel like that's a revolutionary act. So I feel like it encourages us to do the footwork of engaging in community, which is a lost art form in like the meta age. I don't know. And then the last thing I want to say, because I don't want to hog the question, is that this issue of like censorship, because I was up last night looking at what Pew Research had to say about this. Like 90% of Republicans feel like they are negatively impacted by censorship, right? And 90% of conservative Republicans feel like the definition of inaccurate information is often incorrect, right? So I think that I'm in favor of something. This is what I was asking, like why I vetoed your question earlier, because like, what is a third-party, people-powered solution that allows us to identify that? Like identify what information is accurate, what information is inaccurate. You know what I mean? I just threw out a bunch of ideas all over the place. I'm not sure if I answered that question.
No, I think that what I'm hearing from you is that you see the value in having people be able to share their political messages on social media, but there needs to be something done to ensure that the information that's being spread is as accurate as possible. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you ate that up.
Okay.
No, yeah, you did get that right. Yes.
Okay. Jay, how do you feel about the topic?
I think it's an interesting conversation. And I say that because I feel like when we're talking about censorship and when we're talking about especially like what does that mean for like a Democrat, a Republican, a third party person, right? I think, right, it's now starting to open up this conversation of, am I intentionally telling things to create misinformation? And am I intentionally telling a story? Because, right, I was saying earlier, right, I work in strategic communications. Like I've worked like on the campaign side of things. And, right, when we look at certain campaigns, right, that is a strategy. A strategy is misinformation and how I can spread misinformation to a point to cause havoc, but also to a point to cause enough fear, right, using fear-mongering tactics. So I think, right, when we're talking about censorship, I do agree. I think that social media as an entire whole is such a new market. And it is still a growing and emphasizing market when it comes down to regulations and how we regulate it, right? It's not like TV, where we've had TV for such a long time, or radio, where we have like developed agencies specifically for like emphasizing this and coming up with regulations to make sure that when we talk about these things, they're as accurate as possible. Social media doesn't have that yet. And as we watch in this campaign world, as campaigns are continuously developing and trying to emphasize and creating new departments that I remember I was working at SKDK, and their SKDK focuses on TV political advertising. That has always been their focus, but they've started building out and seeing how they can work in digital. Yeah. Because campaigns are needing more digital people to work on the campaign, to be able to do quick turnovers on social media. And I think for me, I think that obviously it's something that is just a growing trend. I think everybody has to be able to adapt, whether you're a campaign, whether you're a university, whatever you are, you're going to have to adapt because youth are starting to get their information from social media. I think that now it's starting to become the question of, well, what does it look like similar, of making sure we are regulating it to the same emphasis and the same aspects that we hold to TV or to radio or to anywhere else, right? Like making sure those same aspects and regulations, I think, are emphasized so that we can't see this continuous strategy that is propelled by some of fear-mongering and continuously advocating and emphasizing certain messaging so that I can stir up a certain base, basically.
Yeah, I think social media has a long way to go to get to the level of regulation that a channel like TV has. Kevin, I want to ask you about your experience because I know that you post quite a bit of political content on social, and I've heard firsthand you talk about your experiences with feeling censored or feeling like your posts have been limited on social. And I'm just curious how you feel about how that's happening on social platforms.
Well, excuse me. So I share a lot of stories online. And I think for me, I understand why there is sort of we call it suppression, but I think because social media companies are private companies, I don't know what their interests are and why they choose to block, suppress, remove certain content. But whatever that rule is, because they're private companies, I do understand that is it's their choice to make. So even when my content gets suppressed or my content, is my page is penalized because I'm posting certain things, if I'm posting about Palestine or if I'm posting about, I've shared content before about like raising awareness for disabled kids who were being abused at a school in like Missouri, and it got removed, and then my page was penalized for months because they were like, you're promoting child abuse. So I was like, well, you're not understanding the difference between promoting something and like raising awareness. But I think my biggest issue is like whatever the rule is, I think should be clear to all users, and it's because social media companies like Meta and TikTok are private companies. Whatever your rules are, I just wish that they were consistent across the board. I don't really feel like social media companies owe us. That's me. Like, I know that there's so many of us on there, and even myself, like, I want to be able to share these stories, but social media companies don't owe us the opportunity to just say whatever we want because they're private companies. I just wish that everyone had to follow the same rules, and that's clearly not the case. So I think that's my biggest issue. But to Herbie's point earlier about like having to do the work offline, I also think that it's interesting to see how people have been able to adjust their messaging and adjust their language when it comes to talking about Palestine and having to be creative. I think that that does some good for activism and for raising awareness about certain issues, because you have to go out of your way to be able to discuss these things, to learn about them if you're using social media to learn about them. So I think that people have found their way around it, and I don't really, again, see a problem with social media companies regulating what's on there. I just wish that we knew what the rules are.
That's a good point, because what I'm hearing from you is that creators need to figure out how to be more responsible with the way that they're sharing their information. I think that's one of the biggest concerns that I have with political content on social, is that it may seem harmless to represent a story with maybe not the full context or a slightly different perspective so that you can create a certain sort of reaction from your base. But what ends up happening, I think, in the larger scheme is we're not even fighting over opinions anymore. We're fighting because we have different understandings of reality, because we're taking these things that aren't true and adopting them into our belief systems. And so what do you do with someone who has a belief system that they fully trust that was based on something that wasn't true? And so I think that that's why I want to figure out how we can do better censorship. But I agree, it's still very, very young and very early, and there's a lot of work that needs to get done.
Well, I do just want to say before we move on that to your point, social media is so young. Social media has been around for 20-ish years. The first real social media website technically was in the mid-90s, but social media is very young and companies are still figuring out what they're doing. But I think that schools need to start teaching their kids about social media. I think that we need to start teaching media literacy, and that digital media should be a part of that, because boomers and Gen Xers who like read something on like The Onion and take it as like fact, that is an issue. But the amount of younger people who are on social media who have no concept of media literacy, that is where I think it's dangerous. Because do I think that we can enforce that we can force companies to adjust their rules? Probably not. But like we can adjust how we teach people how to use these things.
And I wanted to build on that point if I
Sure.
I understand that social media sites are private owned companies, but I feel like we need to really re-examine like our relationship to them, because they are like a town square, like a digital town square for billions of people. And so I think when we're talking about how TV and radio are regulated, they're regulated through the FCC, right? And so that doesn't regulate misinformation. People get on Fox News and lie every day of the week, right? And that's because they have the freedom of speech to do so, right? So I think as a privately owned company, if there was something to come in to regulate that, I think it needs to be just like the misinformation banner is made publicly available and we can see what's misinformation on a given post. I think we should also know the people, and I think it should be policymakers, journalists, legal experts, folks who are experts in the in all of these fields that, you know, all these pieces of content are being censored on, right? So I'm thinking about legal officials, I am thinking about legal experts, I am thinking about journalists. I think those folks' names should be made public as well. And I think that it should be like almost like a jury of your peers, right? I think it should be folks on all sides of the political sphere, dictating what is, one, we should know who these people are. Two, those people should be like experts, should be dictating. And I don't know if this is already happening, honestly. Me and Mark Zuckerberg haven't spoken in a couple of weeks. But I think that if it is happening, that should be public and that should be public information as well.
Yeah. So let's shift gears just a little bit. So I want to switch to a slightly more serious and sensitive topic. So there's been over 30 school shootings in K through 12 schools this year alone in America. And students are feeling unsafe. And a lot of these students are now becoming voting age. What changes do you think are needed to make schools safer for young people? And whomever would like to go first can
School
feel free.
specifically?
Yes.
Okay, so as a parent, my kid is 12, and I forgot about this often, and I'm very happy that like my kid goes to school. I'm lucky enough to live in a state that has really strict gun laws, and then like gun violence is not really a huge thing where we are. And then his school is pretty safe, but I still freak out about these things. And I think that one, for me, I don't think that we're going to be able to really, at least in my lifetime, get a grip on the NRA and how much power they have in politics. So do I think that like huge laws will be shifted? I'm gonna come into all these conversations with a bit of nihilism, by the way. So sorry, but I just don't think that that's possible. So like in my mind, I'm like, what can we do?
Yeah.
And so I do think that manufacturing companies should be held accountable for the way that their products are used and the way that they're marketed. And then on, like a state level, states like Missouri, Texas, Arizona, Alaska, Florida have such loose gun laws that there's so many opportunities, so many loopholes. People can go to trade shows and buy guns without permits, and people don't need a permit to carry. And in some states, you can buy a gun at 18. So of course, all those laws should change. But I think the number one thing is we should hold accountable whoever we can. And so I think that when guns are used to carry out mass violence, that the manufacturers should be able to be held accountable. And then I think when young people, school shooters, who are typically like teenagers, carry out violence, that their parents should be held accountable for allowing them access to guns.
Interesting.
I think the power is in the purse, as it always is in a capitalist country. And I think that, so I saw this like viral reel TikTok of this woman, I think her name is Ryan, and she was saying that insurance companies, there needs to be like a federal mandate that all gun owners need to have insurance, right? And so like as a result of having this insurance, well, first of all, just to like place context to that point, 77% of all the mass shootings that have happened since 1966, or from 1966 to 2019, have been from people who have used guns that they've owned legally, or at least some of the weapons have been legally owned guns. And 80% of all shootings for K through 12 have been folks who have gotten those guns from like a family member, right? And so I think that that's an important framework to look at it, because it's like if for example, if I have insurance on my car, right? Well, I live in a no-fault state, so you can't sue me if I hit you, unfortunately, but you can sue my insurance company. And so that makes obviously my insurance premium go up, and my insurance company has to come out with this money to pay for the damages if I'm at fault. And so I think that if insurance companies have to be held responsible, then I think we'll see movement and progression in that area. I also think that if we're looking at like who's going to be most responsible for paying this money, in many states in the United States, females pay less for their auto insurance than male drivers, because male drivers are like a higher risk for insurance providers, right? So if we're looking at the demographics of people who are most responsible for mass shootings, it's white males. And so these white male gun owners will also be responsible in this idea that I'm like thinking about or fleshing out, would be responsible for like paying more for gun owners insurance. And so I just think that if there's a trickle effect to your pocket and your purse, that may affect change, because if your kid is responsible for stealing your weapons, and not only could you be held, or your kid be held criminally liable, there's also a fiscal responsibility on you, on the insurance company. That's really not the only way, but a really interesting way, I think, of approaching the issue, is attacking it like through, I don't know, people's money, economics.
Interesting.
I would say this as a student who has grown up, in my eyes and kind of in my opinion, I feel like in the age of school mass shootings, like I've been to school in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I've been to school in Fort Worth, Texas. I believe I was in high school when the El Paso school, Texas shooting happened. And I think one of the main things that I think a lot of times that we forget about when we're having these conversations is to an extent how desensitized we become to it. And I think that right, when we're talking about this movement work and when we're talking about this activism work, we become so desensitized to a lot of these different subjects because it's almost as though, and it shouldn't be, but it's become a normal, right? You know, having to go over active shooter drills. It's just as right common as us going over a fire drill, or in Texas when we go over a tornado drill, right? What do we do when a shooter comes in, right? Are we gonna have to fight our way out, or what is the vibe gonna be? And I think when we're talking about how do we start having a conversation, or where do we start this, and I'll go into the abstract and move into the literal, right? It does have to start with a degree of this is not normal, right? It is not normal that you are in elementary school going to have to, right, having a conversation with kids who are age 5, 6, and 7, and they might have to hide underneath their desk to ensure that a school shooter doesn't come and right, take away their lives, right? It's not normal that we have our teachers having conversations about arming teachers in a schoolhouse, right? That's just not normal conversations. And I think that's one of the first parts is, right, calling out a conversation as it is and saying, this is not normal. That's the first part. I think when we're talking on the more abstract piece, when we move into the literal piece, I will always say this, I will always be more of a propeller of people being more involved in their local elections than people who are in the national elections. And the reason why is because a lot of these conversations, right, what did we talk about when we went to the school board meeting? Right? Who were the people on the school board? What did we talk about when we had the state legislative? Like, I even know in Texas, there is an educational side, I believe, that is just educational state representatives. And our conversations that we're having when we're in these rooms, right? What are they? And I think that a lot of times we do such a job of pushing the national election, right? We do such a job of pushing the people who are running for your president, vice president, even Congress, right? But what are the conversations that we're having state by state? Because a lot of times it's our state legislatures that are making these dramatic changes as they relate to gun laws and gun regulations. And so, right, what is the conversation? I'll use even in Texas, right? In Texas, the way the school system is set up, almost every single district is like its own independent government. Your district can make regulations and rules that the district across does not have to follow, may not follow, but the district the schools that are in that district will have to follow. Which is why, for example, when things like COVID happened, right, you would see literally across the street, the schools in this district were all on mask mandates, no school, you're staying at home. You would go across the street, no mask mandates. You could go to school, be perfectly fine, whatever. And I think that is the conversations that we need to start pushing, right? Is how are you getting involved in your local school elections? What are we doing as community activism? But also, I'm also a really big proponent of people who are political movers and shakers, right? That's what I'm going to call them, political movers and shakers, right? The Olivia Popes of the world, right? Like, what are we doing to put people who represent our community in these seats or in these places? Like, a lot of times for local elections, the vote count is literally almost 8 to 9% of the county, right? It is so slim. It is so small. And in some places it's less than that, right? And so if it's a place where, you know, most of the county isn't voting, well, similar to how my sister Stacey Abrams did, right? Like, how do we do a better job at turning out more people to vote in these local elections so that way we can see people who represent us, people who do things like us, people who want policies like us to be putting these things into action. And even then, right, it may not be, right, we may not get to the root of every single problem. I will be a biggest proponent, right, like that we may not get to the biggest root because there are people like the NRA who are extremely powerful, right? But the question now becomes, how do we sidestep them? Right? The NRA can't be everywhere and they can't be anywhere all at the same time. And so how do we, right, do a better job at presenting more organized fronts on local levels so that way, right, we have an entire national conversation around here's what we're going to do, here's how we're doing it, right? Just like how Jesus Christ, Project 2025 came out, right? Like what is the conversation we're going to have around this over the next 5 to 7 years, right? What is our long-term strategic plan to do XYZ things? And that, I think, will begin in my opinion, in my eyes, to start to mitigate, right? Especially a lot of these conversations that are around school shootings. But I think it just first start with, right, us sitting here saying it's not normal.
Right.
It's not a normal conversation to be having.
Well, what I would say to part of what you're saying is like the NRA, the organization, can't be everywhere all at once, all at the same time. But the people who support the NRA, who keep up with gun laws because they identify with them, like they want to have access to guns and they want to be able to do it, because a majority of gun owners are safe gun owners. They own their guns legally and they follow the laws, but they almost act like agents of chaos, because even though the NRA, the organization, is not everywhere, the NRA does fund Moms for Liberty, who is taking over school boards across the country and pushing for less regulation and pushing, you know, anti-LGBTQ rules in schools that sometimes start and seem bigoted, but almost like innocuous, like not recognizing LGBTQ History Month in October. But when they start to do things like enforce rules that make schools less safe, that's an issue. And I agree with you. I think that people like me are part of the problem. People who like resort to nihilism, who are like, things aren't going to change, because the thing is we do have to keep up with every small election and figure out what things are changing incrementally over time. But it's funny you mentioned, or it's sad that you mentioned, like school shooting drills, because I was thinking about this the other day. There were 2 school shootings back to back when school first opened, one in Georgia and then the other where there were 4 victims. Was that Kansas?
I know about the one in Georgia.
In Appalachia, yeah, that's the one I know about.
Yeah. So I was thinking about like shooter drills, and my first shooter drill was 26 years ago. I remember when I was in school. Like, that is insane, as like how long we've let this issue fester. And it's only getting worse, but I do think it's because a lot of us have given up on being able to make those huge changes.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I think about regulation around this topic, the part that resonates with me on a personal level is how I grew up. My mom was a parole officer, so I grew up with a gun in the home. I would watch my mom, you know, put her gun and her, you know, equipment on to leave to work, and then put it away into a safe when she returned. And you know, I was a curious kid. You know what I mean? Like, there were some times where I tried to like play with the safe and see if I can get it out. And I never did. And so, Herbie, when you mentioned these statistics around how many young people are getting access of these weapons that are owned by their parents, I absolutely think that we need to consider what the regulations look like and what the consequences are for these licensed gun owners, or these just gun owners in general, who are making it easy, or there's being some sort of negligence around safety and security, because beyond school shootings, there's still shootings happening by accident. Kids just playing around with these weapons. And so when I look at the experience or the environment that my mom created for me, I knew that she was coming from a place of trying to make sure that I was safe. And I think that for parents who are not creating that layer of safety for the children in their household, I think they should be held liable if, you know, they didn't do what they needed to do to make sure that these accidents or these intentional acts of, you know, terror are like taking out on these innocent people.
Sorry, I just wanted to say one thing, or like not pushback, but like offer a different insight or perspective, because I definitely feel like school shootings are normal. Mass shootings are normal, and I think that is an important place to start from, as opposed to saying that it's not normal. Because if you're saying that your first drill for school shootings was 26 years ago, I wasn't even born. And so I think that my entire lifetime, that's all I've known is school, is these school shooting drills. We had them routinely. So this is America's normal. I think we have to look that truth in the face. And then I also think that as a result of us normalizing it by not passing legislation that would make it more difficult for people to get access to guns or to commit these heinous acts, I think that conversations around mental health continue to come up. And I'm always very very hesitant around that topic, because when people talk about mental health background checks, I just feel like it disincentivizes people from actually getting the mental health that they need, because it's like, if this could come at a consequence of my gun, I'm not going to do it.
Well, also, people who suffer from mental health issues are more likely to be the victims of gun violence, not perpetrators of it. And also, in states that have looser gun laws, like Alaska, which is surprising to me because we don't really hear about like mass shootings in Alaska like we do in like Texas and Florida, but Alaska has one of the strictest or some of the loosest gun laws, sorry. And because of that, Alaska has some of the highest rates of suicide. And I do want to mention that because September is Suicide Prevention Month. And so when you have loose gun laws, you also risk people who do suffer from mental health not necessarily harming other people, but usually people use guns to harm themselves, which is another issue that should be addressed.
Yeah, but there is one thing I do want to say, which is I want to push back on the point that you pushed back on, right? Which is I think when we're having conversations about normalcy, I think that when there can be a conversation around, okay, this is maybe a normal, or this is something, right, that we're saying as long as I've been living, this is a normal for America, right? I think that that also builds complacency, right? And I only say that because, oh, okay, I mean, it's a normal thing that I'm going to see, or it's a normal thing that in my entire time that I might be in primary or secondary school, there might be some type of shooting. Within my entire time. I think that I get scared of having those conversations, right? And I only say that because I think that when we're having conversations around like what is normal, or right, like what is something that is a normalcy, right, for life, that also I feel like builds up, okay, now these conversations around, like I'll take it a step beyond, right, just a school shooting. I'll take a step beyond, like for Black people, right, like us sitting here and having a conversation, right, like I'll use an example with people like with the conversation that happened with me when I was a kid, right, like, like when you get pulled over, make sure your hands are up, make sure you don't make any quick movements, make sure you don't do any fidgeting, make sure you don't do anything crazy, right, because there's not another additional layer of conversation around, well, what does it look like if a police officer, right, does get scared and decide that they want to shoot you? What do these conversations around normalcy mean, right? Because I think that the people, in my opinion, people who have said or who have not been scared of saying something wasn't normal have also been people who have been the drivers of what that change looked like. Martin Luther King, I mean, well, additional, some other people, it wasn't just him, but I'll use him because he was the main person who just came to my head. Right, like MLK like had that conversation around like, okay, it's probably not normal that we have this whole separate but equal clause, right, of we're gonna put Black kids in these poor schools over here, we're gonna put white kids over here, right? It's not normal. What can we do to have a conversation around integration, right? And while we still, of course, have additional steps and techniques, in my opinion, to talk about how to get there, because, child, I don't think the schools are nowhere near integrated, right? I think that there still has to be a conversation of saying this is not normal, right? Like this is not okay and it's not normal, because I feel like when we say that, we're also saying what is normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like what does that normalcy look like?
Well, that's what I was gonna say. Is like, I think what you're saying is it's not moral. It's not a good
Right.
thing. It's an awful thing. But I hear what Herbie is saying, where it's like how often does something have to happen for it to have become the new normal? And I do agree with Herbie a little bit, where it's like, this is awful but normal.
Yeah, I think that what I'm hearing right now is that we're acknowledging the fact that America has a history of having a culture of violence, right? That has not been resolved yet. And how do we, even though this has been going on for so long, how do we still treat it with a level of urgency so that we can actually get to some solutions?
Beyonce said America has a problem.
It does.
Hello,
And speaking of urgent matters that are happening within our worlds, I want to shift a little bit and talk about young people in America and how much they care about what's happening with the Israel-Gaza war. My main question for this group is, do you think that older and younger generations are seeing this war differently? And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that older folks who have more experience, who have seen more, are looking at this and you're like, y'all are shocked that like evil things are still happening in the world. I think that younger people, millennials and Gen Z, haven't had to face this kind of violence in this way. I think because people like me who are chronically on their phones all the time, having to watch this content that you can't, and the fact that it's being called content, but we have people who are trying to survive a war, like, you know, shucking and jiving online and dancing, hoping that people will notice them and, you know, speak up for them. So we are watching this take place in real time. And so it is the first time that something like this has really happened, where we've been forced to face this kind of violence that's happening to people. But I think that Gen Z and millennials have begun to get really annoying about this scenario in a way where it's like, I think we were talking before about the memification of politics and how people communicate online. And I think that now people have sort of turned this real world issue into a litmus test to prove that they care the most, that they are a good person. And they're like, well, I am reading about this. I reposted that thing earlier. I'm like, but what are you actually doing? Because all of us, for the most part, are equally powerless in this situation. There's only so much that, even if we all tried our hardest, there's only so much that we could do. So I think that there is a generational divide in how people are impacted by it. I think that some people, some older folks, aren't necessarily denying it or turning away from it, but they're not as shocked. I think that people who have lived through Vietnam and people who were older when 9/11 happened, who watched a generation of young men be shipped off to Iraq and to Afghanistan, are not shocked that these kind of things happen in the world. I just think that we need to stop censoring ourselves when we talk about issues like that. And I think that social media, because it becomes very self-centered. Everyone's Instagram page is sort of like a magazine, and everyone's a celebrity, and you're on the cover every day. I think that people have made Palestine an issue to censor themselves and their morality. So,
yeah, I definitely feel like young people disproportionately make up the demographic of people who care, or not, I won't say care, but sympathize with Gaza, and that's on Pew Research, right? I think it's like 33% of
you
young
love
people.
Pew Research.
Okay.
I do. You know, shout out to Pew Research. I do though, because, well, that's a whole nother conversation. But yes, so we do disproportionately make up the people who sympathize with Palestine. I think it's something like, well, let me finish that. It's something like 46% of young voters who feel that the way that Israel responded to the October 7th Hamas attack is unacceptable, right? Because of the sympathy that I feel like this demographic has towards Palestine and the level of care that we have towards this particular foreign issue. But I think that sometimes we as a demographic, there's like a false equivalence of youth with anti-imperialism or young voters with, just being incredibly liberal, because even amongst young voters, there's a divide, right, across gender lines, right? Young male voters are leaning more right, still overwhelmingly left, but beginning to lean more right. We see that trend happening over the past decade, really. And so when I'm thinking about the degree of care, when I'm really thinking about the degree of care that this specific demographic has for this issue, I definitely think it's important. But I do often think that it is a representation, the overwhelming representation that we see online of a lot of young folks engaging with this topic is because we care. I want to drive that point home. I want to continually underscore it's because we care. But it's also because it is a trending topic. And because engagement is such an intoxicating currency. And so a lot of people, to your point, are using it as a moral litmus test, but also as a means to get more engagement, as a means to just be in the conversation. And the reason why I say that is because I don't think it's going to really fuel their voting decision, right? What options do voters really have on this particular issue? But I think young people are a lot more focused on the same issues that the entire United States is focused on: the economy, immigration, and healthcare, and by extension, abortion and reproductive rights. So I don't know. I think that it is important. I think that we differ from the rest of the United States in terms of age demographics on our position on this, because outside of this particular demographic, most of Americans are sympathizing with Israel on this particular issue. So I think that's where the difference lies. But even when I'm like representing those figures of like 33% and 46%, that's not the overwhelming majority of young people, right? The overwhelming majority is either pro-Israel or unsure or equally agree with both. And so I don't know. Yeah,
I struggle with the whole like older folks sympathize with Israel more, because I really think it's a matter of a lack of information and a lack of exposure, which is why so many young people are sympathizing with Palestine, because there's so many people who are teaching this stuff and you're being almost forced to learn about it so that you know and you understand what's happening online. I think that a lot more older people would sympathize with Palestine if they had access to more information that just like was not there. Does that make sense?
That's
No,
interesting.
good.
I have a thought about that, but I want to hear what Jay has to say.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think that it brings up a bigger conversation, or as I'm kind of listening, I think that it to me it starts a conversation, especially on because I'm Generation Z, and I think it starts having a conversation around what does activism look like in this generation, and what does it really look like when we're talking about how do we translate a movement that starts on social media into real life. And I think that there was a good degree, I will say, I think that even last year, because last year I was the vice president at Howard University, and one of the things that we did see across collegiate campuses, right, was we saw what was being called, I believe they were called the tent camps, where like collegiate campuses across the entire United States were literally setting up camps in their Howard, like in their universities, outside of sometimes their president's doors, saying, hey, look, like we don't appreciate or we do not approve, right, of this conversation around the support of Israel, right? We want you to say something. We want you to have this conversation. And I think it's starting, in my opinion, to become a conversation around what does it look like when we now move the movement from social media onto a campus, or we move it out of social media, period, right, into the bigger, broader world. And how do we, in my opinion, translate that into... So I'm a political realist. Like how you're a nihilist, I'm a political realist, right? And so my whole entire thing is right, how do we win? That's my biggest conversation, right? Because in political science, the number one thing they always teach us, right, is politics is who wins and loses and who gets what, right? And the conversation now is how do we win this conversation? How do we win this topic? How do we win in these moments, right? And I think that there was good momentum. There was good momentum when we were starting to talk about collegiate campuses, and when we were talking about how they were really serving as places for activism. And then, right, the summer happens, right? Things start to die back down. Things kind of move back to social media, and the conversation now becomes, what does it happen when it's no longer trending? Right? What do we do as activists, or what is the conversation now being had in terms of keeping this continuous fight, right? I move everything back to politics, right? That's just my vibe, right? And so that's why I always say, how do we win on this conversation, or what does it look like for us to win on this subject? And I think the other problem is, and this is just like my conversation, this is something I do usually of a general critique, right? Which is a lot of times people who sit on certain sides become very reactionary to certain things, right? When we talk about long-term strategic planning, right? One thing I will say for both the, whatever you want to call them, whether you call them the right, the conservative, whoever you want to call them, right? One thing they have always been very good at, though, has been the long-term strategic planning of things, right? How can I ingrain segregation into the economy and ingrain it into this conversation without calling it segregation anymore, right? How can I ingrain this idea of love and patriotism and nationalism, right, while no longer calling it patriotism and nationalism anymore, right? What does it look like for that? And I think that that is usually on our side, or I guess, right, like when you look at things like even like the left, or you look at like the liberal, or whatever the classification you want to use, right, there's not ever been, in my opinion, a conversation of what is the long-term plan, or what is the long-term conversation. It's always a reaction to whatever the most trending conversation is, right? Even like I even use like brief things like this to help like synopsize back up, but right, I'm using these brief things like what happens after Kamala, right? What is our conversation that we start talking about when it's talking about us putting up and having somebody who we approve of, and someone who we think represents the ideas? Because I think that there is a divide that's happening, right, between between generations right now. There's a generational divide that's happening, and so I think to synopsize it, I think that the Palestine-Israel conflict, it really revealed a lot, in my opinion, about what activism is going to look like for the future of our generation. And I think that it also, in addition to revealing its strengths, I think revealed some of our weaknesses. Yeah. And I think that it's now becoming a conversation of how do we, this isn't something new, but it's something in this social media that's just exemplified. How do we do a better job at keeping topics trending longer? Right? How do we keep it at the forefront of everyone's eyes, at the forefront of everyone's kind of where everyone's feeling? Because I think that's where if we're going to synopsize it back to, it's based off of what's trending, right? How do we keep it trending, right? What does that look like?
But how do we keep it trending without people benefiting from it? I think is my biggest issue. There are so many people who, when October 7th happened and that whole like first 2 months, when it really started to, I mean, it got worse, but when things really started to blow up and people started to pay attention, I was posting about Palestine, and I was posting about the airstrikes and what was happening and the updates that I thought were important. But then I started to just get so much reaction, and so many people who started to follow me for those updates, that I stopped doing them, because I'm like, I'm not, I don't want to build a platform off of this. And it feels like there's so many people who are like, Instagram gives you bonus reels, TikTok monetizes your page, YouTube monetizes your page. So the amount of people who are benefiting monetarily, or if you just see like, clicks and engagement as a currency, there are people who are benefiting from keeping this trending without offering any real solution or doing any real work. So I think that you're right, but I also wish that again, people weren't profiting off of a war. Because I think when we think profiting off of a war, we think about gun manufacturers and like lobbyists, but it's like now with social media,
it's everyday
people are pretending to be activists in exchange for having a reach.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about the gap between older voters and younger voters on this issue, Kevin, you mentioned something about just access to information. I'll note that this specific war was the first time that I felt so connected to the crisis that was happening on the ground in Gaza. I was old enough, you know what I mean, after the war that followed after September 11th, but I don't recall seeing so much intimate content around combat and seeing civilians in this state, you know what I mean, right in front of my eyes. And I think that what we're seeing is that there are independent journalists, there are people, citizens on the ground in Gaza, and just normal everyday people who are just trying to show the rest of the world what they're going through and what they're experiencing. And I think that because of the platform being social media, I think that a lot of younger audiences are feeling a lot more emotionally urgent around the topic. And when you think about older audiences, they may not be relying on social media as much to inform them about what's going on in the world, right? They might be looking at more traditional and legacy media outlets such as TV or newspaper. And the concern with that is that at times those outlets can be filtered, right? And they can be edited in a way to tell a certain side of the story. And not to say that that can't happen with social media content, but I think that not having that very intimate on the ground visual given to you all the time as soon as you open up your phone, in between your cooking videos and your travel videos, I think that may be resulting in older generations feeling a bit more distant or emotionally distant from the war, and maybe not feeling like it's as much of a priority as to their future in America. And so for like, this is sort of just how I've noticed it when I've talked to like my parents and my relatives, is I have this big passion for what's happening there because I'm seeing these videos and you can't unsee it, right? And my family is just like, really? Like, is that a huge like concern for you for the vote? Because they're thinking about other things. They're thinking about education and affordable health care and reproductive rights. And so I say that to bring us into the last question that we have for today. But you know, the personal is political. That's what we're all here to talk about, our personal experiences with what's happening in our political landscape. So I want to ask you all one question. What political issue hits the closest to home for you?
HBCUs.
Okay.
That is what's personal. I attend a historically black college university, so I attend Howard University, the illustrious, whoop whoop. If you know, you know.
And you know that we
okay,
know.
you know. But HBCUs are personal. I think right now we are in a high, right? We are on the verge of putting the first black woman, a proud HBCU graduate, into the highest office in the land. And we are on a high. But in the midst of what seems like the forefront, right, what's going on in the background, I think, is even more scary. We see HBCUs closing continuously due to lack of funding. We are constantly noticing the failing infrastructure of our campuses. We are watching our universities continuously struggle, right, while we are having this conversation. And don't get me wrong, right? I will live by my Howard University. But I think that there has to be a broader conversation around what does it really mean for you to provide support, right? Like, what does that really look like? Howard University is the #1 producer of black doctors. We are the #2 producer of black attorneys. We are the #2 producer of black attorneys who go to Harvard University. The #1 producer, Harvard. So, right, what does it really look like when we're talking about, right, having these monetary, and I don't even want to use Howard right now. I don't even think it's fair to me to use Howard, because I think Howard a lot of times becomes the showgoat, right? It becomes the showgoat for HBCUs, and it becomes this is like the stunning city on a hill, Howard University. I want to talk about, right, I want to talk about the Tougaloo colleges, right? I want to talk about the Fisk universities. I want to talk about the smaller universities who are practically like struggling to keep their doors open because there is not because there's not the same monetary support to schools like Spelman, Morehouse, Howard University, right? That's going into these schools. Like we need, at the end of the day, to have a genuine and real conversation about what does it mean to keep our doors open. And I think that for me, right, that is what I talk about when I talk about what's personal, right? Is whether or not my HBCU one day is going to be subjected or become one of the ones that's going to have to close their doors because we couldn't figure out how to keep ourselves funded. So that's what it is for me.
It's so funny that you say that, because I was what's personal for me is the inadequate funding of black, brown, like in public schools, in black, brown, and underserved neighborhoods. Because I grew up in an underserved community, and I ended up having to go to high school outside of that environment, because we know that like public schools get a lot of their funding from, local funds. And if you live in a more wealthy neighborhood, you probably that money, right, you have more money to go towards infrastructure, materials. And I just feel like I truly do believe the children are our future. Word to Whitney. And I feel like there's a deep rooted connection, obviously, between education, liberation, and if you are severely underfunded, that directly impacts or has a deleterious effect on your ability, your education quality, but also your capacity to engage with politics, your capacity to engage with civics and propaganda, because that's like been a theme of this whole conversation. Like, how are you able to interpret misinformation, disinformation, particularly in the meta age where it's becoming much more difficult to detect with AI and deep fakes and people being able to pay for different campaign ads and make it, and also like what y'all voted for, which is paid promotion from influencers. Those things make it a little difficult for I think if folks don't have the proper education to be able to understand what they're seeing and to interpret what they're seeing, then the next generation is screwed. Like, I feel like in a lot of ways you can feel very you can feel defeated if you don't have access to that information. And then also with what you referenced earlier with Moms for Liberty but Not Justice, it gets really interesting when they are, because to your point as well, the right has been able to, they're so good at galvanizing and organizing across the country, creating chapters and organizations, joining school boards to change the policies or just curriculum in given schools. I think that when we have anti-inclusion groups like that, it becomes even more, I see even more directly, and I'm more directly impacted when I'm seeing like, wow, they are trying to destroy the schools and make their adversary, which is what they view fellow Americans of color and of the queer experience, trans experience, they view us as an adversary. They're trying to make us weaker in the political space because if you can, I don't know, I feel like if folks are undereducated, you're less equipped to fight. So that's something I'm always thinking about, because I should not have had to go out and pay $14,000 USD to get a good education. I should have been able to go to my local high school and get a good education, but I didn't feel like I could. And I'm sure many people did, right? But I didn't feel like I could because the ceilings were literally falling, right? And yeah, so it just, that's the most important, not the most important, but it's something that's really both political and personal to me.
You know, Herbie, I'm going to just jump in, then Kevin, I'll let you go.
Yeah.
Because we are sharing a brain right now, Herbie. We share a hometown. We both grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. I too went to a school outside of my city to receive an education that my mom thought would be better for me. And educational reform is something that's super personal to me as well, because we mentioned this backstage, but the topic of like, okay, like you were the one who got out of Trenton, you know what I mean? That's a sentiment that I definitely feel like I hear when I'm talking to high school friends in Trenton, New Jersey, friends who I meet in New York or in other cities that are from Trenton. And I think that seeing so many generations, the generation that I came up with, and now seeing the younger generations, and just seeing how there just isn't as much of an investment in these schools that should be. It seems almost as if when we as a country go through a deficit or through a recession, education funding is one of the first things that we kill. And we need that for people to become productive adults in the world and be able to contribute in a way that's going to make us all safe and make us all feel like we're living in an environment that's for everyone. And so that's something that's really emotional to me as well. It's unfortunate, but a lot of kids don't really have the best homes to go to. And so by creating an environment within a school system that is actually going to teach them not only core subjects like math and science and English, but life skills, you know, how to prepare for adulthood. So that's something that's very personal to me. I didn't want to cut you off, but go ahead, Kevin.
No, you're fine. Something that's really personal to me is protecting trans people. I think is something that I've been hyper focused on for the last 1.5 to 2 years. It's personal to me because, you know, growing up, I always said, like, the second I get out of high school, I'm coming out of the closet. Like, I can't. And there were years that I wanted to be myself and felt like I couldn't. Then my senior year of high school, I became a dad, and then I was in college. And so being a person who could finally be themselves took me a while. And the first people to create space for me and to hold space for me were Black and Latina trans women in New York in the gay scene. I started working in New York City nightlife when I was 19, 20. And then like they were always there for me. And so whenever I read stories about how trans people are being dehumanized and villainized and attacked I think about those women, and I think about people like Monica Extravaganza who made me feel safe when I was young and trying to figure out who I was. And trans people are under attack. Trans people are dying. Black trans women are dying. In 2024, there have been over 500 anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation that have been introduced in state legislatures across the country. 170 of them specifically target trans people. And in a couple of months, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to make a decision on whether or not states can constitutionally ban access to gender-affirming care, not just for trans youth, but in some cases for transgender adults. And so right now, 150,000 transgender youth are at risk of losing their gender-affirming care, and that means that thousands more will never have access to that care. And this year, between January 1st and August 10th, a transgender person was murdered in the US every 7 days, which is insane. Trans people are a fraction of our population, and they are being murdered in mass numbers. And trans people are the reason why we're able to have this conversation, why we're able to create rooms like this. LGBTQ people owe trans people everything. People like Marsha P. Johnson fought for gay liberation. Marsha P. Johnson, fought for cis white men to have gay rights. And then at the first Christopher Street March or Pride, they were booed off the stage and not allowed to walk in the front of the parade. So I think that Black trans people and trans people in general, but specifically Black trans women, I think are owed a lot. And I think that right now, everyone owes them time to dedicate to protect them. So.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Kevin. Before we wrap up, I want to give you all an opportunity to let the listeners and let the audience know where they can find you on social media, if they can follow you to keep updated with you. Kevin, let's start with you, and then Herbie, and then Jay.
Sure. Yeah. So the best place to follow me is on Instagram at Here's Why Kevin.
Yeah. The best place to follow me is YouTube. It's just Herbie Revalis. But you can also follow me everywhere else, Herbie X Revalis.
For me, best place to find me is going to be on Instagram at J_Jones. It has 3 Y's and 2 S's and 1 underscore. And if you're ever in DC, just come on to Howard's campus. We're an open campus. Okay, so just come to ask for me.
Yes, that's an open invite. Okay.
She said they know who I am.
Well, Kevin, Herbie, and Jay, I want to thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and being honest and vulnerable with us. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. That is all the time that we have today. This mini-series is brought to you in partnership with GLAAD. Part 3 of The Personal is Political will dive into anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation affecting our rights. So make sure you clock in. If you enjoyed Part 2, let us keep the conversation going. Let us know your thoughts and questions at surfacelevelpodcast.com. And remember, stay curious.